Look at us. We've made it all the way through. Good day to all. We are on chapter 28, the final chapter of the book of Acts. It's been an exciting, it's been more than 27 weeks, but we'll refer to it as a 27-week journey. It's actually been longer than that when it's all said and done. So the intro, 28 weeks. I know it's 28 chapters, but we mixed a couple, combined a few along the way. Anyways, we've been doing this since July of 2020. So you thought 2020 was long. This was quite a marathon in itself. Anyways, it's been great to do. It's nice to be able to end it now and to just wrap up this wonderful book related to the trials and travails of our friend Paul and the work that he did and how the gospel was alive and well and continues to be to this day, and how Acts points to that at this point. In a couple weeks, we're going to start Revelation. We'll start the study of Revelation here in a couple weeks, similar sort of format, and we'll start posting on that very quickly. So that'll be very exciting whenever that's all said and done and we get all that going. I hope that you guys will want to join us at that point when that happens, because it will be quite the deal. Anyways, back to Acts. So chapter 28, Paul has been on a treacherous journey, sea voyage, around the Mediterranean, not as far on the Mediterranean as he wanted to go, actually much further on the Mediterranean than he wanted to go, or that the people that he was with wanted to go. It lasted about 14 days too long, and finally, as the ship is being torn apart, they at the island of Malta, they come to shore, some floating, some swimming, some carrying others along the way, but eventually all land on the island of Malta, significant distance from where they wanted to be, but alas, there they are, as we, for the most part, have hit the final journey of what we know about Paul as he does his final route into Rome. Some things to think about is like chapter 27 can be looked at as the equivalent of the story of Jesus' crucifixion. If you were to go back to the end of Luke's gospel, the Gospel of Luke, which of course Acts then continues that story on, but you could look at chapter 27 as that, and chapter 28 is closer to the day of resurrection, where many strange and new things happen, as we learn, as we will read through on the island of Malta, and as we continue and finish up this book. And these strange things that people just can't put their finger on. There's just things that happen, just like on the day of resurrection, things that happen that people are just like, wow, it is amazing. What is happening is hard to explain. It is hard to really identify how this is working, but all we do know is that it is the power of God working through this as we go through all this. We look at this chapter as a version of the resurrection story that Luke is trying to explain through this situation that Paul has been in for the past several years. The book of Acts covers several years. It's not, I think sometimes we read Acts and think it happens relatively quickly, but it's over a several year period. Right now, we're probably at about 64 AD 64. Yeah, that would probably make about as much sense as we know at this point, based on who Caesar is at the point there in Rome, most likely being Nero, and everything related to that. What we learn from this, and what Luke is really trying to portray through this entire book up to this point, all the way through this book, is actually is about the gospel and what the gospel is. We know gospel being the Greek word that I'm not going to pronounce right now, but anyways, means good news, the good news that is being spread, that is alive and well. It is living and breathing. The gospel is. It's not something that is static and sits there. And Luke makes that very clear as he talks about the travels of Paul. And so this very thing that Jesus had said for them to do, if you look at the Great Commission, is they have finally reached the ends of the earth. So Rome at this time, especially in Paul's and Luke's perspective, was the ends of the earth. It is the end of the known Jewish world for the most part. Of course, we know at that time that Rome spread all the way into Spain and eventually into what we refer to now as the UK. So that was even further out, but that is the beginning of going to the ends of the earth. So beginning of that final journey of the gospel spreading that far. And who knows, by that point, some people even said that the gospel even traveled beyond Rome. going west by that time. Anyways, but here we have Paul here in Rome doing what Jesus said in a couple visions along the way, and what God had proclaimed, what Jesus had asked of what Paul to do, and to reach Rome, and that he would make it there safely. As we read through this final chapter, reflect on the previous chapters and see how God is a just God. A lot of what Luke is focusing on here is God's justice and how God will put all things right when it's all said and done. A God who has delivered Paul time and time again, just as he said he would, and finally does the final delivery for him into Rome, as he said he would, is seen to be a just God. Luke shows us a pattern of this throughout, where you have this pattern of accusations and vindications throughout the book. If you recall, whenever he went before Agrippa had for the most part said this man should be set free after the accusations, though he had appealed to Caesar. The storm tried to take Paul and his companions out, but the storm fails. We'll get into that a little bit more here in a second. Well, we can get to that right now. The idea of a storm, or the idea of being at sea, especially in ancient times, was evil. Is all about evil and what was evil. And they looked at the storm or the sea as an evil place with evil things happening. They also looked at serpents in the same way. And a just God delivers Paul from both of those. As we know, in Malta, when the snake tries to take Paul out, he is delivered from that incident as well. And there's a whole lot of different things we can talk about snakes and reptiles there on the island of Malta, and what kind of snakes and reptiles were there during that time, and what kind of snakes and reptiles exist now, and how it's different. And anyways, there's a lot you can go related to that, the ecology of Malta, if we wanted to, but we don't have time for that. But just watch for other patterns along the way where you have this vindication or accusation and then vindication, and see how God's justice works throughout all of the book of Acts. Well, that was a very long introduction, but as we continue on through this, we look at verses 28, 1 through 10. Here, I'll read those first, focus more on verses 1 through 6, and then do the rest through 10, and then make our way through all 31 verses today of chapter 28 of Acts. When they had been brought safely through and then found out the island was called Malta, the natives showed up extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain they had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on a fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. There's some stories about that one. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. We've seen this happen before, haven't we? Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island, named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed, afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery. And Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. They also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. So here we are, Paul and his buddies have landed on the island of Malta. All 287 people? Yes. Some people say it was just 87, but others would say it was 287. These were really, really big ships. It wasn't like something that you see in these movies about Jesus and Peter, and where they're kind of floating around on that little dinghy up and down the Sea of Galilee. These are probably 187 feet long and about 50 feet wide, these ships. So they're very large grain ships that they were on. So no doubt it could have easily held that many people. And there are some other ships that are even larger that I believe we talked about chapter before, or the chapter maybe 26 or 27, where up to 1,000 people would be on some of these ships. So nothing like a Holland America cruise by any stretch, but anyways, there were a significant amount of people. So they all finally, as God said in the vision, or Jesus said in the vision to Paul, they all make it safely ashore there into Malta. They had been tossed and turned so much, they were not sure where they'd landed. It's kind of like the Gilligan Island reference I made chapter or two back, where they had hoped to make a 3-hour tour across the Gulf, but ended up in a whole new world. And for the most part, they didn't know where they were. If you read the context here and what the sailors had recognized and what they had seen, they did not know where they were. They probably had an idea general where they were, but they didn't recognize the island in which they had come upon as a typical island. There were, of course, I imagine there were probably some of these sailors had made it to this island at some point, but probably many of them hadn't. And if they had, they would have ended up at the port of Valeda, which was not close to where they ended up. I believe now it's called St. Paul's Cove or St. Paul's Key. Anyways, I'd have to remember and go back, but it is named after St. Paul now, this area that they landed. Some have confused where they landed with a place called Melita, which is off the Dalmatian coast, but that has based on confusion related to the Sea of Adria and the Adriatic Sea. We talked about that a little bit in the last chapter. The Sea of Adria and the Adriatic Sea are actually two very different things. So it would not be possible if the Eurokilo winds that were blowing them along was coming out of the northwest. Northwest, yes, I believe so. This would have driven them opposite of that. They would have had to go north to end up in the Adriatic Sea. So anyways, they end up down at the Sea of Adria. Driving them, they're for the most part being driven away from the south coast of Crete, which if we went back to chapter 27, verse 14 and verse 27, you'd be able to see that. The name Melita, which is also known as Malta, is named by Phoenician seafarers. It is a Canaanite word for refuge, so it can be assumed that this island was a place of refuge for many. We can assume that many seafarers had ended up here, probably not as they had wanted to, but ended up being there because of this wind that would blow them in that direction if they happened to leave a northern port a little too early or a little too late in the winter season, and then of course get blown by these northern winds, cold northern winds, to that port there in Malta. If we look at verse 2, the Maltese people are of most likely Phoenician origin and spoken most likely an Arabic dialect. Greeks and Romans would think of anyone who spoke Arabic during that time as barbarians. For the most part, barbarians, a little bit different than what we mean today when we say barbarians, but just pretty much people who don't speak Greek or Roman, or probably Roman wasn't even a language, Greek or Latin. So that was what that would look like there for their version of barbarians. It seems that these barbarians, though they were called that, were quite hospitable, and there's actually not 287, it's 276 people who were on that ship, and these cold and wet passengers, and they treated them very well, as we can see. Verse 3, and it's probably, the Roman soldiers may have had something to do with it, to kind of like, well, maybe we need to keep in line because these Roman soldiers are here, but it seems like they were just a genuine hospitable group based on the context of what we read here and how people respond to them. It doesn't seem like they're responding out of fear, but out of hospitality. Paul, as he is and is known to be, continues to be very much the helper, and as he helps keep the fire going. This guy's been at sea for weeks, tossed and around. He must have been exhausted, but yet here he is gathering wood where it must have been relatively cold based on the time of year in which they landed and the location in which they are. It is identified with a snake that he picks up. Some people would say that the snake was within the sticks that he had picked up and was probably rigid from the cold. That's what some people would say who know more about snakes than I do. It makes sense. I know that cold-blooded reptiles do not move at all when they're cold, and they become very rigid. And so maybe that's what happened. And once the fire had warmed up this cold-blooded animal, or this cold-blooded reptile, he probably thought he'd jump up and thank Paul for throwing him in the fire, and bit Paul at that point. The Greek word that is being used here, because this is so much fun when we go into details like this. The Greek word that is being used here is viper, but there were no vipers in that area at that time. At least vipers is what we think of them today. At least not today there are any poisonous snakes on that island. So even back then there may have not been any poisonous snakes. Now some people may argue the difference of that, but there aren't any there today. Possibly Malta is much like Ireland, where there are no snakes. Where there were one, I guess there were snakes at one point, but they were removed long ago. Remember, St. Patrick did his little ditty, and all the snakes left Ireland because of that. According to this, the way this is written by Luke here, and if we looked at the original text, the snake holds on and bites and holds on, which is different from what a viper would do. A viper would strike and get away, versus a snake like this would grasp and hold on. And some would even say that possibly this could have been a type of lizard and less of a snake based on what it is. And Luke would fully understand kind of what was going on here. As a doctor, he'd probably seen many snake bites or lizard bites or whatever you want to refer to this as. And he would have been very familiar with it. It could be that if this is a snake, and I believe it would be, is to be what they refer to as a Cornella austriaca, which had small teeth and did little harm. And I've been bitten by snakes before, and though it's very weird to be bitten by a snake, there are many that are not venomous that will bite you, and they will hold on, and they're not venomous, but they have really strong jaws, and that's what happened to me. So maybe that's what happened here with Paul. Anyways, Paul flicked it off. I did the same thing, and we all went about their day, and so did Paul. As we look at verses 4 and 6, the barbarians, it was to the barbarians when they see something like this, of course, them being what we would refer to as superstitious, and what they would refer to as just the reality in which they lived, is that the gods had finally got their man. The gods that they believed in had finally got their man, and the snake would surely kill him because he is a murderer, and that's what happens, is that though one murderer may escape one way that someone has tried to kill him, or the gods have tried to kill him, he will not always escape and will eventually get his due. Divine justice, of course, as we know, would not stand back, but instead we have a plan B. So we weren't able to kill him on the boat, so here's plan B. We'll kill him when he lands on the island with the snake. Of course, that didn't work. After waiting for a while, of course, they realized nothing is going to happen. And so there's only one other obvious conclusion, which anyone would make, especially during that time, is, well, this guy has not died from this venomous, viperous snake that the gods had sent upon him. Well, obviously, then he must be a god himself. And so obviously this man is not mortal. And so we get kind of a little bit of Luke's sense of humor here as we look through this, as he explains kind of how their quick change of mind. So if you read this in the original Greek, you'd kind of see more of the humor than we do now, but that's just the way the context works, and how sometimes when things are translated in English, it's not as sarcastic or funny as the people who have originally read it would see. People of Lystra, which was, of course, another place of barbarians because they didn't speak Greek, thought that Barnabas and Paul were gods, as you can remember, but then remember they quickly turned on Paul and tried to stone him, or they did stone him, if you go back to chapter 14. So for the most part, Luke seems to be providing some sort of contrast here from the last God experience, because he's considered to be a god, and I imagine they figured out at some point that he's not, and come to that realization conclusion, versus the opposite of when back in chapter 14, where they thought he was a god at first and then they wanted to kill him. Okay. Verses 7 through 10, we meet Publius. He heals the father of the chief of the island and many others. We get a designation of the first man of the island, possibly an official title. Depending on your translation, maybe he'll be the leading man of the island, or the first man of the island. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a title, but it could have been. Could be just someone who is wealthy and built up part of the island and has a lot of people who work for him and has a lot of people who owes him money, or who knows what it could be. Either way, it is Publius, and he seems like a relatively nice guy, and he obviously lives relatively close. But then again, if you looked at the island of Malta, it's not huge, and so everyone's probably relatively close together. And so he entertains these 276 people along with Paul for about 3 days. And the father of Publius, as we learn here, is suffering from dysentery, or some sort of obvious gastrointestinal conflict, and which we on tradition would have been traditionally on Malta actually had a name for it, would call it Malta fever, which no longer seems to be an issue there in Malta. But it had something to do, is the understanding that back then, and even up to maybe the recent past, there's some sort of microbe in goat's milk that would cause this sort of stomach discomfort for him. So anyways, Paul helps heal this gentleman. And anyways, as expected, and in any good, tightly knit community that's, of course, very well networked, even without phones, they seem to realize and understand that this man, Paul, can heal people. So word spreads fast that there's a healer on the island. Luke possibly could have employed some of his doctor skills in the healing process, and he probably did step in and help along the way. This is just assumed based on the pronouns that are being used here of honored us with many honors. Most likely money for payment for the healings is what had happened whenever this was all done. Also, based on the usage of Greek here and tone of text, is all very much a medical story that is being provided here by Luke. What we're seeing him talk about here is that it's almost like you think of it as a MASH unit that had been set up, where people kind of set up an ambulatory hospital where people would come and they would get healed or given medicine or given some sort of treatment from Paul or even possibly Luke, and then, of course, go upon their way. And of course, as you can imagine, an island like this, which is kind of off the beaten path, probably really appreciated somebody who either had divine powers to heal them or even someone like Luke who had the knowledge to be able to heal. Before we go into the next section here, once again, the guy who was thought to be a vile murderer, someone who thought to be someone who is ruining the Jewish faith and tradition and being just a big problem to all of Jewish society, is again shown to be someone who is a trusted and valued member of society. The islanders believe that even after the accusation of the snake, that he was instead, of course, an innocent man. They thought at first, of course, that maybe he, as a prisoner, he had done something that one of the other prisoners had done, such as murder or steal or whatever those others had done, or just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they thought that they were vindicated or understood this response based on the snake biting Paul. But instead, we find, again, that Paul is innocent. And this happens time and time again for the Romans. Every time the Jews accuse Paul of being the bad guy who's causing all kinds of problems in the synagogues and in the Jewish community, the Romans come around and are like, hey, wait, this guy's actually innocent. We're not sure what you're talking about. So you misunderstood, or at least we're misunderstood Paul. We go as far back as one of the first times that he was arrested and brought up into the garrison in which the guards were and would hold him for a while until he were to go meet with Festus and Felix and Festus, and see that at first they were actually going to beat him because they thought, okay, this guy is a bad guy, but then again he is vindicated from that. So what we're doing here is setting up for the final voyage, showing us that the evil sea and the evil servant, as I said before, and many times in ancient texts would depict are always depicted as evil, and could not keep Paul down. These evil things cannot keep Paul down. Thus, it could not keep the gospel from spreading. So God allowing Paul to continue to exist allowed the gospel to continue to spread. Now, did the gospel need Paul? I would say no, because God will do what he needs to do to spread the gospel. I mean, look what he did to get Paul to start doing it. The road to Damascus tells that story. Anyways, so we see that happening here, in that Paul is a significant part of it. So Paul himself will physically arrive in Rome, probably not in very good shape physically, but he brings with him the good news, something that nobody can ever stop, and is actually in very good shape, as we learn when they land in Rome and land close to Rome, and we also know from the other churches that Paul helped start. All right. The next section, let's do just a much shorter one. Well, 11 through 31 is actually the final section of this, because Paul and his arrival at Rome. But we'll start with verses 11 through 15. But before we do, it's finally time for Paul to go to Rome. After all this time, from off to Rome, and to Rome they go. They head up to just to kind of give you a brief overview of what they do. They head up to the island of Sicily, which to the port of Syracuse. To the foot of Italy is their next stop. At the port of Rhegium is where they end up, and finally make it north to Puteoli, which is the Gulf of Naples, as their final port of call, and from there they hoof it up to Rome the rest of the way. This is the final leg of what has been about a 2,000-mile journey that began at Caesarea. So this has been a huge, huge journey. I mean, just imagine, most people do not travel that far their entire lives, but it is something that we see Paul doing here. All right, verses 28, 11 through 15. At the end of the 3 months, we set sail. So notice that Luke is very much part of the story based on the pronouns that are being used. At the end of 3 months, we set sail on an Alexandrian ship which had wintered at the island and which had the twin brothers for its figurehead. After we put in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. From there, we sailed around and arrived at Rhegium, and a day later, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day, we came to Puteoli. There we found some brethren and were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and thus we came to Rome. And the brethren, when they heard about us, came from there as far as the market of Appius and 3 inns to meet us. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. So this is the last lap of Paul's final journey. Could we call it a victory lap? I would say we can. It's very vague what happens to Paul after Acts. But it seems like he has done what he had been called to do. He had been called to take the word, the gospel, to the ends of the earth, to the Gentiles, and that's what he does, to go and speak to the Gentiles, and ultimately to go speak to Nero or Caesar there here in Rome. The 3 months that we see here are the 3 months of winter, so the remaining 3 months of winter, that they remained there on Malta, which means they could not continue their journey until early spring, so they had a nice little respite there in Malta to prepare for their trip north. Pliny, who I have mentioned before, a historian and philosopher and many other things, would say navigation begins typically during that time of year when the west winds start to blow, and that's typically the first or second week of February when that would happen. It seems they jumped aboard another ship in the Alexandrian grain fleet. Remember, a lot of the grain came up from Alexandria, Egypt, and so there were a lot of grain ships that would float or that would take off from Alexandria, I believe, hit Caesarea, and then make their way up eventually to Rome, with many ports along the way. Most likely they spent the winter in Veleda, the very place they had hoped to end up, but alas, did not. The heavenly twins that we see here are the sons of Zeus. That is Castor and Pollux. Very typical for boats like this to have these sort of carvings on the front bow of the boat. And for the most part, they are known as the patrons of navigation and were very much the devotion of many sailors. If you were to look at your, I guess, for star constellations, they're referred to as Gemini, it was a sign of good fortune in the storm. So they would see it in the sky, and during the time, know that they had good look ahead if they were able to see this constellation in the sky, and of course, they would put it on their boats as well. Based on Luke giving us the name of the ship, he did not, for any other, tells us he had heard about this ship before seeing it. Maybe one of his new friends at the island had told him about it. So we get a little bit of more context related to this and what Luke and Paul are up to. Verse 12, once aboard the ship, they headed from Malta and about a day landed at Syracuse, which is on the east coast of Sicily. They spent 3 days there, most likely because the southerly wind slowed down. Syracuse was a very important city there in Sicily, as it had 2 ports. It was founded as a Corinthian colony in about 743 BC and became under Roman power in the Second Punic War, which was about 212 BC. From Syracuse, they make their way to the toe of Italy, also known as Reggio di Calabria or Rhegium. This was an important harbor on the Italian side of the Straits of Messina, which is the northeast corner of Sicily. It seems it was only 1 day wait time as the southerly winds picked it back up and allowed them to head from Puteoli, also known as Pajoli, in the Bay of Naples. They had traveled about 180 nautical miles in less than 2 days, so the wind was moving them along pretty nicely, if you really look at it. Puteoli is most likely is the most sheltered part of the Bay of Naples. The principal part, for the most part, is the principal port of southern Italy. It was also a vast emporium for the Alexandrian wheat ships to go there. This was apparently quite the deal, as they would be escorted by faster moving ships announcing their arrival. So this was a big deal for them. Unlike other ships, they kept their top sails up, so the wheat ships were given top priority whenever they were to come into a port like this, because of the importance they had to the running of that society. that these top sails allowed them to be recognizable and allowing them to get easier ports. So everyone else would lower their top sails when they entered port, but the wheat ships would keep them up so that those who were guiding people in would know who the wheat ships were and then be able to guide them into the port so they'd be able to offload more quickly. Verse 14, there is a large Christian and Jewish population, both brothers and sisters. Don't let brethren fool you. It is typically used when you're reading about Paul or when Paul's writing. Brethren is typically a non-gender specific, so usually meaning male and female, or brothers and sisters came. Anyways, there was a large both populations of Christians and Jews there in Puteoli. The Jewish population is probably only second largest in Italy to probably the one in Rome. We can assume that the centurion, who was a grain official, had business there, which is why they stayed for the length that they did. As you remember, the centurion who is guarding Paul, not one of the soldiers who's directly guarding Paul, but who's overseeing Paul in the trip, is most likely, as we talked about in the past, he's responsible for wheat getting from Alexandria to Rome, and so he's doing his job along the way besides just watching prisoners. This then allowed Paul to spend some time with his fellow believers. This was a typical gesture that the centurion offered to Paul. As you can recall, he allowed in early on in the voyage, back in chapter 27. So after a week there, they hoof it on up to Rome. A few miles into the journey, there in verse 15, excuse me, they end up on the Appian Way, one of the great Roman roads of southern Italy, named after Appius Claudius, and it is the road to Rome. Along the way, some friends hear about Paul's journey, and they come and meet him, and they come down from Rome. Most likely heard that Paul was coming from the network of Christians in Puteoli, so they head south to see Paul. Again, word travels very fast in ancient times. Even though they didn't have the technology we have, it seems like still things got around very quickly. And again, they stayed where they were for a week, so it had some time to travel from Puteoli on up into Rome. The way Luke writes, this shows us that he's using a technical and official term for welcoming of a dignitary. So what would typically happen during that time period if a princeling or a king was coming to town, people would go way out of town to go greet the king or the princeling. And so a similar sort of thing going on here is that they're treating Paul as, you could refer to it as royalty, as they are knowing that he is coming and they want to welcome him there to come in as he eventually enters Rome. Some only go as far as Tres Tabernae, also known as Three Taverns, which seems to be a roadside stop on the Appian Way. It's about 30 miles south of Rome. Others walked an additional 10 to 13 more miles and met him at a marketplace of Appius. So a lot of walking. Can you imagine? They got their steps in every day. Based on what Luke is telling us, Christianity has already become to be well established in Rome, which is not something to be surprised about. And so Paul's not bringing the gospel to Rome, much like he had in other places that he had visited, where he's not actually starting churches, as the churches had already started there in Rome. It had been about 3 years since Paul had sent his letter to Rome, well, actually probably closer to 2 years. Depends on who you ask. And his prayer was to see these people, which has now been granted. And he must have been quite happy to finally see the people of Rome who had become Christians, to be able to spend time with his Roman brethren there in Rome. Let's just verse 16 very quickly, because there's a lot to it. When we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who was guarding him. I'll just read to 22. After 3 days, Paul called together those who were the leading men of the Jews, and when they came together, he began saying to them, "Brethren, though I had done things against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem to the hands of the Romans. And when they had examined me, they were willing to release me because there was no ground for putting me to death. But when the Jews objected, I was forced to appeal to Caesar, not that I had any accusation against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I requested to see you and to speak with you. For I am wearing this chain for the sake of Israel, for the sake of the hope of Israel." This is huge what he's saying right here. "They said to him, 'We have neither received letters from the Judea concerning you, or have any of the brethren come here and reported or spoken anything bad about you.'" Let me look at that real quick. Verse 21 comes across a little bit differently. Yeah, that is a little bit different. Of course, with Jews, it was males, so it's probably better to say brothers. Anyways, verse 22. But we desire to hear from you what your views are for concerning this sect. It is known to us that it is spoken against everywhere. Wow. Bum, bum, bum. So as we continue on here and work through this. So verse 16, Paul is handed over to be kept under Roman guard. It seems that all the prisoners were handed over to what is referred to as the strapodearch, which is the commander over a Roman legion camp. Paul, however, was allowed to remain on his own while the other prisoners go off to their little camp. And he has his own, very own Roman soldier to guard him, which actually they rotate, I believe, every 4 hours. Have to look into that. I think so. We'll look at that here in a second. There, of course, is a large camp or barracks where the emperor's praetorian guard was housed near the Viminal Gate. You can think of it as the Roman army headquarters, I think some people would say. Some would argue that outside the camp was not part of the original text. Either way, we learn that Paul was able to stay in lodgings of his own that, of course, he would have to pay for out of his own money. There, as we will learn, is able to he is, though he is with this guard and really can't go anywhere, people are able to come to him and receive visitors. So he does receive visitors from both the Jewish and the Christian community. He is, for the most part, able to live like as a private resident, as well as much as you could, with a Praetorian guard lightly chained to your wrist. Every 4 hours or so, I was right, a new guard would come and would join Paul and relieve the other. And Paul, unfortunately, had no such luck to ever be relieved of not having somebody attached to him. At this point, the we narrative has come to an end. So Luke is taking himself out of the story at this point. And as they arrive at this the city of Porta Capena, it is understood that Luke stayed based on the belief that Paul wrote Philemon, and he also wrote to the church of Corinth while in Rome. Luke is mentioned in both those letters, so most likely Luke was there. And of course, I mean, you could say, of course he was there because he wrote the end of this, but not necessarily. A lot of this that he wrote, some would say, especially the ones that don't have the we or the us references in them, could have been stuff that was told to Luke later on. And we had a couple of examples of that in earlier chapters. So verses 17 to 22, and then again through 28. Paul will meet with the Roman Jews. He does twice, and for the first time, he has his first interview with the Jewish leaders there in Rome in verses 17 through 22. And as Paul has liked to do in his visits to other cities, he meets with the leaders of the Jewish community. Again, another pattern that Paul likes to do. Unfortunately, he is under house arrest, so he's not able to go to one of the many synagogues in Rome. And there were many synagogues in Rome, many different Jewish synagogues were there based on different nationalities. Not all Jews were from Judea. And so there were nationalities and many different types of Jews that were in Rome. So there were many different types of synagogues. He was not able to go to those, of course, because he's under house arrest and would be for the next couple of years. He provides them with a brief summary about how he ended up here and how he was brought to this place. Notice how he makes it clear that he has nothing against Rome or the Jewish leaders in Rome. He's trying to make that very clear because there were people who were thinking, especially during the time of Nero, that the Christians were trying to undermine the Jews and make them look bad and to get them kicked out. And the Jews had already been kicked out 10 years earlier and now had, for the most part, returned. But there was that kind of undercurrent of distrust between Jews and Christians. And Paul is trying to make it clear here that no, that is not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make this something that is good for everyone, for everyone to hear the good news, no matter what it is. He's also trying to appeal to his innocence. The interesting part of all this is that what he is trying to do is, of course, is explain to those who should have already known, the Jews, the very hope of the Jewish people or the very hope of Israel. And that's what has brought him to this point. That is what has brought him through everything from the arrests, the beatings, the snake bites, the shipwrecks, there were 2 of them, and has brought him to this point, was to be able to verbalize to the Jewish people, and of course to the Gentiles as well, the hope of Israel. And this very hope has cost him his freedom, and he makes that clear by bringing up the chain reference that he brings up. He brings the same message here as he did in Judea. Again, he's talking to Jews here, and he talked to Jews there. And so Jews hear things about the same, but yet differently, especially since they're on different parts of the world for the most part. And so they're hearing things a little bit differently here. But the resurrection that he claims is not to undermine the religion of the people of Israel. It is supposed to be a continuation of what they believe, their hope. It has been divinely fulfilled. What they believed has been divinely fulfilled, yet they are too closed-minded, it seems, to hear it. Well, most of them are. In verses 21 and 22, Paul receives a very diplomatic response from the Jewish leadership. Most likely, a letter or messenger was sent from Jerusalem to Rome, but it seems that either he had been delayed and never did make it, and so the Roman Jews really were not familiar with the insurrection and other issues that Paul was causing back there in Judea and other parts of that part of the world in Asia. It seems the Roman Jews are not willing to make a decision at this point since they have not received word from Jerusalem, which is fine, and that's pretty Jewish for them. With that said, it also seems they are not willing to take any action against a Roman citizen who had appealed to Caesar, of course, because they couldn't, and it'd be against the law for them to do so, because he's obviously a citizen who's appealed to Caesar, and so the Jews really can't do anything. They can listen and they can get angry if they want to, but they can't really touch him. The Roman Jews seem to have heard some of the concept of the way as we've talked about before, this new sect of Jerusalem, the new Jewish sect, or Christianity as we call it today, but they did not take it too serious or look at it favorably. They didn't either like it or dislike it. They actually disliked it, but they're like, whatever. To them is another sect that has popped up and is causing issues in the Jewish faith, and they just hope it would go away, as we know they've talked about in the past. Either they could beat it out of people, kill them, or hopefully it just dies out once the leader gets killed. We can assume they were at the same time not ignorant of the Christians in Rome. They're probably very familiar with all the Christian churches that had popped up. It is hard to tell when the Roman church actually started. We know that Paul sent his letter to Rome in AD 57, and at that point it seemed well established, and they were well known for their faith. If you were to go back to the letter that he wrote to Rome, Romans 1:8 and 15:4, you'd see that. It may have been one of the first churches established actually outside of Judea and Syria. We know that 10 to 11 years before Paul arrives to Rome, there was an introduction of the people of Rome, leading to riots, which led to Nero cracking down on the community. Let's see here. How did that work? That was it the Jews? No, that was is the idea that the Jews were upset with the Christians showing up, and so some riots had started and bad things happened, so they're kicked out of town. Once the new emperor came in, or the new Caesar came in, Jews were allowed back in, and then this is about 60-ish, and so about 10 to 6 years later, you have pretty much the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans with the destruction of the temple back in Jerusalem. So we're in very tense times between the Jews and the Romans at this point, and of course the Christians are now thrown into the mix as well. So no one's really wanted to make any waves here because there's already kind of this underlying tense thing going on between the people. All right, verses 23 through 28. When they had set a day for Paul, they came at his lodging in large numbers, and he was explaining to them by solemnly testifying about the kingdom of God and trying to persuade them concerning Jesus from both the law of Moses and from the prophets from the morning until evening. Again, see here, he's talking to them as Jews and not as Gentiles, because when he spoke to the Gentiles, he didn't bring it up related to the prophets and Moses and that stuff. Some were being persuaded by the things spoken, but others would not believe. And when they did not agree with one another, they began leaving after Paul had spoken one parting word. The Holy Spirit rightly spoke through Isaiah the prophet to your father, saying, go to this people and say, you'll keep on hearing, but will not understand. You'll keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull, and with their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them. Therefore let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles. They will also listen. So he's saying what he's saying that he's said before, and that is that the Jews will ignore him and not hear. Well, most of them, there are some that do. And then because of that, he will go to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles will listen. When he had spoken these words, the Jews departed, having a great dispute among themselves. And he stayed 2 full years in his own rented quarters, and was welcoming all who came in, preaching the kingdom of God, and teaching concerning the Lord Jesus Christ with all openness and unhindered. That is really great news to see that the Romans were not interfering at all, and it seems like the Jews had kind of either ignored him or just put up with him, or could care less. Either way. All right. Let's roll through this, and we'll call it a day, because that's what we do around here. Paul has his second meeting or interview with the Jewish leadership, as well as a few others who decide to show up and hear what Paul has to say. He continues to show that he is speaking, is fulfilling what has been taught in the law and the prophets, what Moses had very well taught them, that they should be listening, because this is what Moses had said, and why are they not listening to him? The gospel of Christ was the fine flowering of Israel's religion. It was the whole course of Hebrew history and prophecy has led up to what he is speaking of. He is not making this up. This is not something new. This is something that the prophets had spoken to and pointed to for years. The text that Paul would reference would be the Jewish Old Testament, of course, and which was interpreted by the events of Advent and the work of Jesus of Nazareth. We can imagine that Paul put everything he had into telling the Jewish leaders in Rome the truth of the gospel. You have to think this was probably a very impassioned conversation that he had. It was not a monologue of Paul speaking to them, but probably something much more like an intense debate with a bit of passion thrown into this. It wasn't just him standing on at a lectern pontificating about this Christian faith, but instead a lot of questions back and forth, a very impassioned part of it. Some have argued that though Paul had said that he had done nothing to go against the Jewish people or the ancestral customs, was, as he knows, he has said before that he is someone with a clean conscience. Others would argue otherwise. They would say that, well, what about this, Paul, where you this time you had spent with Gentiles and did not follow Jewish custom when you were around Gentiles? Is that being of clean conscience is one thing they would argue. And also, if he was a true Jew, he would have closely followed the customs of the Jews, even in a Gentile environment. So how are you even a true Jew, Paul, is what they'd say. And Jews in Rome were known to only eat like figs and nuts and maybe berries, according to the historian Josephus, in order to remain pure. And we're relatively clear this is not the habit of Paul. And so there were probably a little bit of nitpicking that was going towards Paul to kind of denounce or to say that his argument of him being a true Jew is it's weak cheese. Anyways, but we know better than that based on what we know about Paul. It seems that some have decided that Paul was saying had some truth to it, while others, it seems, this is verses 24 through 28, were not convinced with what Paul was teaching, and they would not acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah no matter what Paul had said. This is the same pattern Paul had faced in many other cities where he had traveled. He would first speak to the Jews, and when they turned their back on him, he would go to the Gentiles. Paul is very consistent with how he did his work. And maybe Luke wrote it in a very specific way to look like Paul was very consistent. Paul probably wasn't say he wasn't consistent, but we can see that time and time again what Paul does and how Luke is trying to communicate how the gospel continues to move forward no matter who is against Paul and what Paul is trying to say, the gospel moves forward. For the most part, all of the Jewish communities besides, I think it was Berea, would say that, for the most part, ignored Paul, so something to keep in mind. Again, in Rome, he's ignored again, and this happens leading Paul to quote the Christian testimony of Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. Isaiah is told not to expect a positive response from the people that he is prophesying to, and it seems Paul should not expect a positive response as well. So Paul is just kind of staying in line with his other prophet friends, Isaiah. Thus, Paul's ministry is divinely ordained. Those who will not hear will become deaf, and those who will not see will become more blind. They'll become even less willing to understand what Paul is trying to teach. We see in the Synoptic Gospels where Jesus brings this up many times, where he's facing Jewish people. If you go to Matthew chapter 13, verse 13, and Luke chapter 8, verse 10, both give examples of where the Jews are not listening to Jesus. They do not have ears to hear or eyes to see. And so that is what Paul is explaining to them here. So Jesus would reference Isaiah 6 as well. So again, Paul announces, as he has before, this time with a bit more finality to it, the Gentiles will have priority in hearing the word of life, and unlike the Jews, they will accept it. The Gentiles will accept the word, while the Jews will not. So we see from the Jews rejection, but from the Gentiles we see unchecked success and a whole lot of hope out there that what Paul is teaching is in fact true and is something that they can believe and hope in. Verses 30 through 31, as Paul remained in Rome, the gospel continued on unhindered. Paul remains in Rome for what we know to be 2 years. It could have been 18 months, depending on who you ask. But he is not able to go anywhere. And he wanted to, based on his close connection, of course, with the Roman guards. However, fortunate for him and how nice the Romans were to allow people to come to him. It may have been for his benefit that he couldn't go out because they'd probably try to kill him. Or maybe not. That's purely speculation. But anyways, he stayed close to home. Luke makes it clear that Paul lived on his own expense or his own earnings. We conclude that he most likely lived in some sort of tenement housing. Some people would say the third floor of a multi-family building. It probably wasn't too horrible if the Roman soldier was living there or even the centurion had something to do with it. But it was, not the best of situations. He possibly paid for it by doing some of his tent making, some would say, which of course would be difficult if you have someone attached to you. But who knows? Maybe that's what he did. There's debate about what happened the 2 years. Like I said, if it was fully 2 years. One option, possibly a statutory period of possibly about 18 months, where prosecutors would come up from Jerusalem with their case, and with some additional months, there'd be some formalities attending to him eventually being discharged, mainly because the prosecutors never showed up. Now, that's probably not going to happen. And the reason that is that it was against the law. If someone was to accuse somebody of somebody, it was against the law for that person who accused or the prosecutor to not show up. And if they didn't show up, they would be either fined or imprisoned themselves. So that they had to show up. The appearance of the prosecutors was mandatory. And so to say that it just faded away is probably not a good argument. And also, just because the prosecutors did not show up, if they did not show up and ended up being fined or somehow, arrested or whatever, it didn't automatically mean the defendant got off the hook. So we have to look at it that way. Another option is based on the court load. It could have taken 2 years just for the hearing to be heard. Maybe Mr. Caesar had many other cases ahead of him. We know that was written from earlier on by Luke in chapter 27, verse 24, that Paul did stand before Caesar. What's really odd is that Luke does not bring this up. Some would say that the outcome was so well known that Luke did not need to inform anyone about the outcome. So everyone knows that Paul stood before Caesar, and Caesar he stood, and yada, yada, yada. We don't know. I mean, it's not fully given a lot of information about what really happens there, and Luke is silent about it. One other argument that we cannot be sure about, but yet could have some truth, is that Paul's persecutors arrived in Rome in early AD 62 and successfully prosecuted Paul for being someone who is a disturber of the peace. And with Nero as king at that point, and he is married to a pro-Jewish wife by the name of Poppaea. They married in AD 62. This would be on the prosecutor's advantage based on how Nero had reacted to Christians in the past. So a pro-Jewish wife to Nero would probably be to the Jewish people's benefit and not to Paul's. Some have looked a little bit further to AD 64 when we have the Great Fire in Rome and Nero blames and then kicks out all the Christians. Some historians have concluded that Paul was released, but after a few years of liberty, he was arrested, imprisoned, condemned, and executed. Again, we cannot be sure, though there is a lot of speculation out there. With all that said, what seems to be important, according to Luke, is that the gospel was proclaimed freely in Rome by Paul. It is unlikely that there was anything Paul was saying that was illegal or subversive propaganda. A Roman citizen under guard would not be allowed to speak in such a way, so there's nothing that he could have said that would be illegal in Roman terms, because if you're attached to a Roman soldier, and the Roman soldier hears you're talking stuff against Rome, that's not going to happen. And so he seemed to not be doing anything against actual Rome itself, at least according to the authorities. As mentioned in chapter 1, verse 8, he speaks the truth of the gospel unhindered. And that was, if you go back to chapter 1, verse 8, you see that was the intent of all this. And this is what Paul does. Paul is divinely led by God, allowed to go all through this huge 2,000-mile journey and many other journeys along the way, and to be able to, in an unhindered way, to go before Caesar and to speak the gospel to not only Caesar, but to the people of Rome. And of course, from Rome, a huge hub leading out to spokes all around down the Roman road. Not the thing that people like to do to get people to believe in God, but the Roman road, the actual Roman road that was built at that time. It was an amazing area that Paul could be in to help spread the gospel, and that's what happened. So Paul fulfills what God said, or Jesus in his vision said he would do, and the gospel continues today because of the work that Paul did, and he, of course, leads by example for us today to be a person of hope, and a person of perseverance, and a person of good conscience, and to move forward in that way. All right, we did it. We made it through Acts. That was a long haul. I mean, gee whiz, good times. Anyways, it was an enjoyable pleasure. I hope that you can join us when we do Revelation, which will happen in a couple weeks, and we hope you have a good rest of your week. Thank you.